Welcome to At the Table, a podcast by the Ohio Leadership Advisory Council. I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Lolli, co-director of OLAC. This is a space where Ohio education leaders come together to explore timely and relevant topics shaping leadership, learning, and school improvement across the state. Whether you're a superintendent, principal, coach, or classroom teacher, there's a seat for you here. Let's get started. Today, my guest is Tricia Couts-Everett. And Tricia is a member of the Ohio Department of Education Workforce Development. Could you talk to us a little bit about what you're doing at the department at this point in time and a little bit of your background? Because I think that's important for people to understand from where you've come.
Thanks, Libby. I appreciate being here. Thanks for having me. I currently am serving as an assistant administrator for the Department of Education and Workforce, and I'm serving within the section for literacy achievement and academic success. And I've served there for about a year and a half. My previous experience is I have over 25 years of experience in education, and that experience has taken me across 4 different states in many different roles, including reading tutor, classroom teacher, English learner teacher, instructional coach, and most recently curriculum director. So I have my master's in education, and although I lived in all of those states, I was born and raised in Ohio and received my undergraduate degree at Miami University and my master's at Malone in curriculum instruction and professional development.
Great. Love and honor before you go on.
Right. I have to give a shout out there.
That's right. Right. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your background because I think it's important for people to understand that those that work at the Department of Education and Workforce have experiences like we have in our schools and in our classrooms. And it's really important for them to understand that you've walked the walk and you've talked the talk. So thank you for sharing that. One of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit with you today is it's really an exciting time in Ohio, and especially at the department. There are lots of changes, and I know that you are heavily involved in the process with the Ohio integrated MTSS multi-tiered system of support that's happening right now. That framework is being developed. Could you describe for us exactly what that means? We are hearing those words and we are understanding some of those words, but tell us about what that actually is.
Certainly, I'm thrilled to be able to do that. One of the things we talk about first before we get into the framework itself is we make that connection to our mission at the department and our priorities. And the reason for that is the framework really connects just very well to that. The mission at the department is to support Ohio students, families, and educators to ensure that every student has the knowledge and life skills for success upon graduation. And the other thing we are just very proud of is that we have a governor in the state, Governor DeWine, who has a laser-sharp focus on Ohio students, on the children in Ohio. And in particular, he is keenly aware and supportive of the literacy priority for K through 3 students, as well as that priority of accelerating learning for K-12 students in math and literacy. And we really look at the integrated MTSS framework for the state as a mechanism to deliver on those priorities and fulfill that department mission. The second thing we always want to talk about and acknowledge is that MTS is not new. So it's been around for years. Aspects of an MTSS framework, such as data-informed decision-making and shared leadership and professional capacity, these topics are not new. And so the work, districts and schools have been doing this work at the local level for a very long time, whether it is as an MTSS initiative within their school or whether it's specific component features, it's happening.
Yes.
And so we also know that state support teams and educational service centers have been supporting districts and schools in that work. So we want to reiterate that the state framework is not meant to be a trigger for, this is something new, you must throw out what you're currently doing and do this new thing. We really are looking at the framework as the glue for what we need to deliver for students, a way to ensure we're delivering effective instruction for students. And it really encapsulates all of those things that we know work according to research, and how can we stay laser focused on what works. And so when we think about the framework, we have developed a framework that includes 5 learning components, student learning components, and 3 adult implementation components. The 5 student learning components are very familiar. They're at the core of what any MTSS structure includes, which is let's conduct some universal screening. Let's always make sure we're using data to inform our decision making. Let's provide a continuum of supports for learners. Let's progress monitor to make sure that what we're doing is effective. And when we have some problems that we are not quite sure how to resolve, let's bring a team together to solve those problems. The adult implementation components include shared leadership, which again has been within the state, right?
Yes.
We captured that language intentionally and brought it into the framework. And then professional capacity, which we know in particular with the literacy legislation, professional capacity of high quality, building the knowledge around how to deliver instruction through high quality instructional materials is critical. And then also communication and collaboration. You know, the work that the Ohio State University has done with their Family Engagement Center, all of these things that are currently existing in the state are embedded and included within this new framework, this state framework that is new. And we're just looking at this as a way to enhance the work that's existing, develop in areas where we may not find that we have things in place, as well as to refine our existing structures, both at the department, within the department, and within local schools and districts.
When you think about the Ohio Integrated MTSS system, what is it not?
So that is such a critical question. We do try to, we are intentional about conveying what it is and what it is not when we talk about it. What it is it's a framework for all students.
I love that. I love that it's for all students.
Yes, it is for all students, and we really are intentional about messaging that because of the history of it focusing, supports for students focusing on identifying those at-risk students, which is absolutely critical and part of any integrated multi-tiered system of support. So we are looking at, when we say all students, we mean students who are at risk for not meeting grade level expectations, but also including those students who, through a universal screening process, have been identified as meeting grade level expectations and demonstrating, therefore, readiness to go beyond what those grade level expectations are. In addition, integrated, so that term integrated, even though really every multi-tiered system of supports, when implemented correctly, has integration embedded within it, we called that term out because we really want to look at academic and non-academic supports being included in how we deliver effective instruction. What it's not. It is not a pathway to identifying students for special education. And we want to be really clear on that the state framework is really about identifying needs of students and delivering effective instruction based on those needs. And all students have needs, whether those are behavioral, academic, a specific domain, et cetera. How do we identify those and make sure their needs are met from an instructional perspective? And it is not just identifying who needs intervention services. It's also about looking at Tier 1 core instruction. That's like the first look, right? Because we want to ensure that all students are receiving solid, effective Tier 1 core instruction so that we can look at strategically who really needs the targeted and intensive instruction. So how does Tier 1 core instruction play a part in that process?
And I think it's so important to talk about Tier 1 instruction. I've gone into a couple of school districts either as a curriculum director or as a superintendent, and they had more interventions than they did time for Tier 1. And I really believe that if you have high quality, consistent, focused Tier 1 instruction, and you use the state curriculum, and you teach students, not necessarily the textbook, that your interventions are cut way back, and they're periodically needed. And I don't know if that's been your experience or not as a curriculum person, as you've watched that Tier 1 intervention evolve, or Tier 1, instruction evolve, or not.
Yes, I think that is really you've hit on, an intended outcome of the framework is making sure we're paying attention to what is happening in Tier 1 instruction in terms of how students are learning, but also, when we think about those adult implementation components that are intentionally included in the state framework, it's really about looking at it in terms of what supports do teachers need, right?
Right.
So it's definitely a supportive, proactive, responsive, all wrapped up into one approach, and we want to make sure we're emphasizing that teachers are set up for success. Do they have the knowledge, the skills? If not, are we providing them with training? What training might they need? What does the time look like, in terms of infrastructure, schedules, and resources available, assessment tools available? So when instruction is not effective for students, it's more than just looking at the high quality instructional materials, but looking at, which is very important. Very important.
Absolutely.
I don't want to downplay that, but it is critical also to look at a lot of different things that could be contributing. And the framework includes all of those things.
On a little different vein, Ohio schools for almost 20 years have been using the Ohio improvement process as their continuous improvement framework. And within that, there's, of course, a leadership framework, and it's about shared leadership and that sort of thing. From your experience and knowledge of the Ohio improvement process and your work with the integrated multi-tiered systems of support framework, what are the similarities and maybe some differences that you might want to point out? Because one thing that's important is for people to know is that we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and that we're trying to make sure in the state of Ohio that we are doing things that work. So what's your thought about the similarities and differences?
Yes, I appreciate the question, Libby. At the department, we continue to focus on improvement processes. And the framework, Ohio's framework, is really being utilized as a lever to improve. It's a lever for improvement. And the important thing to remember here is that ensuring improvement practices are focused on instruction. It focused on delivering effective instruction at the building and classroom level so that we impact those student outcomes. So the framework allows us to zero in on what our focus is for improvement when we're implementing continuous improvement processes. So some consistency in practices that I can highlight are, you'll see in the framework and be familiar with shared leadership.
Yes.
So shared leadership was a part of the OIP processes, and including the teaming structures. Strong teaming structures was important. That two-way communication is mentioned in the state framework as important. That it's termed bidirectional communication, and that is another thing that will be familiar. And then another piece that will be familiar is that database decision making. So that's just a part of the business of being an educator, is looking at data to make instructional decisions, and as well the team-based problem solving. So I see those as being strong connectors. Regarding the differences that where districts and schools may need to enhance or refine their work, or what might be new to them, That really depends on what their level of implementation is or their current implementation. Because again, they've been implementing MTSS for a long time. So when we provide training, and you can look at the statewide webinars to see that the messaging is really about looking at those department subpages for each of the components and looking at those essential features and determining what do we have in place, what do we partially have in place, and what's not quite there yet, just to refine. And I believe you're going to find a lot of things that are already in place. Having said that, I will highlight a few specific things that might be different.
Okay.
And that is that clear focus on the delivery of effective instruction as the lever to improving student learning outcomes. And so those student learning components really can be seen as specific actions that need to be happening in the building and in classrooms in order to improve and deliver effective instruction. And then, as I said before, those adult implementation components really zero in on the adults that the decisions that the decisions that the adults are making impact and support the delivery of that effective instruction. And so when we look at building the adult implementation component of building professional capacity, that's all about how do we support educators and non-educators, anyone who is providing supports, academic, non-academic, to students. Do they have what they need to be able to do their jobs well? It's the yin and the yang of the framework, so to speak.
That's an excellent explanation. We all know that leadership matters. Superintendents and central office staff have to support what happens in the buildings. With the integrated MTSS framework, how is the principal role different or the same as it has been in the past with, for example, other improvement processes like the Ohio Improvement Process or any other continuous improvement process that you're familiar with?
Mm-hmm. Well, the role of the principal is critical, and the research speaks for itself on how critical the building leader is to running a building and creating a positive climate and culture and ensuring that effective instruction is delivered. And so in the past, principals may have focused more on general management or compliance, which is very important. And, no one's going to deny the need for those items to be taken care of. But principals, with this new framework, their role shifts a bit toward creating the conditions for high quality instruction in every classroom. So some of their work where they may have looked at it as strictly managerial, perhaps it's not siloed thinking now where I'm building a master schedule or I'm working on transportation schedule, and now I'm thinking about how do the decisions that I'm making impact the delivery of effective instruction. And one major change that lines up with the recent legislation regarding literacy in Ohio in particular is that emphasis on the use of high quality instructional materials. And principals, need training. Do they have training? Do they attend the training on those high quality instructional materials? And do they know how to ensure that those materials are being used effectively? And for example, Ohio's literacy laws are designed to make sure every child has the most effective literacy instruction. And that means that districts aren't just purchasing those new materials. It means that they're expected to implement them consistently with integrity or fidelity, depending on the materials, across all classrooms and for all students. And this is where building leaders play a critical role. And principals also need to be equipped to support teachers so they don't fall back on outdated practices. We've had years of literacy instruction in the state of Ohio. And so we have outdated practices that we need to make sure, and ineffective practices to make sure that those don't creep back in to the system. So principals have to understand what that high quality instruction looks like and in literacy and in math, and be able to recognize it in action and data collection through walkthroughs is important, and that's time consuming and hard to find, but it is critical that building principals know what's happening in classrooms so they know how to support teachers better. And principals need to know what's happening not only in core instruction, but also understand what's happening in the other tiers of instruction, targeted instruction, intensive instruction, and be able to use that data to guide what supports are needed for not only classroom teachers, but coaches, and then professional development and decision-making is all impacted by what they see and what they've learned and gleaned from what's happening during these walkthroughs. And the department has worked really closely and continues to work really closely with state support teams and educational service centers to provide that support for principals in these efforts.
That's really excellent. I think that the support that principals receive from a variety of associations, or from their personal associations, or from OLAC, and of course from the State Department and university supports that they receive will certainly help them move through this shift. I remember when principals would say, well, I'm too busy to come to the professional development. No, that's part of your job. You have to learn this. If you're going to supervise teachers using whatever it is, you have to know about it. You have to be able to talk about it intelligently and understand why and what should be happening with that. So I think that's it's really an important shift. We're actually starting to move towards that instructional leader that we've talked about for how many years now?
Yes.
That research came out a long time ago where we talked about the principal, the leader needed to be an instructional leader, and that's what you just described. So I'm excited about that.
Absolutely.
Refocus.
Absolutely. And I am, the amount of support principals have in the state of Ohio is something to be admired from all the professional organizations that are available to them. So certainly there's no better time to be a principal in the state of Ohio as this state framework comes out, because the framework is crystal clear. Professional organizations have been wonderful partners in wanting to learn about the framework and really tailor the supports that they're providing to teachers and to principals to the framework. So I think it's very exciting.
I agree with you on that. Mm-hmm. In my years as a principal, as a curriculum director, as a superintendent, multi-tiered systems of support really fell into the special education department. And my intervention specialists were experts in that area. Principals, not so much most of the time. Superintendents, not so much most of the time. And I'm talking about myself in that vein. I mean, I knew it and I knew how it worked and that sort of thing. Today, the department is talking about this integrated MTSS system for all students. How does Ohio's framework support this shift? And you've talked a little bit about that before, but
so one of the key things that occurred when we were developing the framework is there was an intentional move to have the team developing the framework, the core team, kind of facilitating the development of the framework, really live within the. You noticed I said my role is within the section for academic literacy achievement and academic success.
Yes.
And so we did, through our technical assistance with the AIR Center for MTSS, have some discussions about, the rollout of this. If you don't want it to seem like it is strictly a school improvement effort, or it is strictly a special education initiative, where this work comes is important. And so, to your point, we want this. We intend for this framework, and this framework is to serve all students. And that is a shift historically from where the work has come, because historically we know we had RTI and then early iterations of MTSS, and now this current iteration of MTSS, which is the integrated, from all the research, all the years of research, this integrated MTSS framework is important. And when we look at the student learning components, we are looking at them as identifying needs and serving and meeting those needs. And all students have needs.
Considering the existing awareness and work related to MTSS occurring in districts and schools across the state, were there any specific benefits or barriers that the department identified when developing the state framework?
Definitely. We spent a lot of time considering how a state framework could enhance the existing MTSS work that we know is already happening in districts and schools across the state. And so we've been intentional about communicating that districts and schools should not see this as a time to start over, but rather it's a time to look at their local frameworks and as compared to the state framework in order to determine specific areas that need development or refinement. Benefits of the framework include developing coherence at both the system and instructional level. How can we create a clear and consistent path to improve student outcomes? Coherence means looking closely at instruction and systems that have historically been siloed. PBIS, RTI, math, reading, math, art, reading. So how can we look at those and find pathways to making a student's day more coherent as they move through it, and making a teacher's day more coherent as they move through the different systems that they encounter throughout the day? So a couple of ways that we look at integration as a lever for coherence. And so we can integrate in a couple of different ways. One is to integrate, like I said, those academic and behavioral domains, because we know that behavior impacts learning, and effective instruction can impact behavior. And so how do we look at those things together versus as separate siloed things? We also want to highlight, the framework highlights the integration of data. So how do we look at data? So if a student is struggling in literacy, is it a literacy team that's sitting looking at the literacy data and just the literacy data, or are they also considering attendance data and how the student's attendance might be impacting literacy outcomes? What about behaviors? And again, not to say that this is not already happening in districts and schools, but the framework itself is really underscoring that that is a mechanism for improving coherence across the system of the school. Another piece about integration would be integrated teaming structures. So we have a lot of teams in schools, in districts and schools. Can we look at teaming structures so that when a team comes to the table, the team has expertise in all of the areas that are needed for consideration when we're looking at student needs or small group needs? And then finally, the components themselves, the student learning components, those 5, on our framework graphic, they're represented in a line, but they're not linear processes, and they're not even siloed processes. So when you're looking at universal screening data, in comes database decision-making. When you're looking at a continuum of supports, well, you're using data to inform what instructional practices you are going to select for a student. The other piece when we think about barriers is we spend a lot of time and we communicate about the triangle. So historically, the triangle is associated with MTSS. And we can see it in our minds visually, red, green, yellow. But there are several misinterpretations that we want to take care of in terms of how that triangle is interpreted. So for example, MTSS is often associated with that triangle, and sometimes it's interpreted as, if we have this triangle, we're doing MTSS. When in reality, the triangle really represents just the continuum of supports, which is one of 5 student learning components and doesn't even include the adult implementation aspect. So really what we need to be thinking about is the continuum of supports differently. Another misinterpretation is that those tiers represent students.
Yes.
Tier 1 student, Tier 2 student, Tier 3 student, or a location for services. Tier 1 students, Tier 2 students receive instruction in this location. Really, the triangle represents, if we think about the triangle and those tiers, it's really about putting supports inside those. So like a menu of instruction and supports and resources readily available, because as I said before, every year we have students coming in with needs. Do we have the resources readily available to meet those needs once the data tells us what the need is? And then finally, another misinterpretation is when we think about the triangle, we can sometimes see that 80%, 15%, 5%. And sometimes it's interpreted as, well, I should only have 15% of my students needing Tier 2 instruction. And they feel they can't, perhaps they feel that they can't provide instruction beyond that or meet the needs beyond that. Really what that 80%, 15%, and 5% is representing is what is the health of the instructional system. 80% is really representing a baseline for if you have at least 80% of your students responding to and meeting grade level expectations, then your Tier 1 instruction, high quality instructional materials are probably on point, but might need some shoring up. So it's really about the effectiveness of the system versus the number of students that should be within each of those layers of the triangle.
I think that's a really good explanation. Oftentimes we jump from the 80% to the 15%, and I can't serve more than 15%. Well, if you're serving more than 15% of your students in Tier 2, what's wrong with your Tier 1? Has always been my question. And I think while I look at it in that way and the way that you're explaining it, I think it's really important to make sure that we're constantly looking at our quality of that Tier 1 instruction so that we can make sure that it's more than 80%, hopefully, that are meeting expectations. Because 80% means that you've got 20% that are not. Mm-hmm. So that 20% can be, in some school districts, 200 children. And that's not acceptable.
It's an excellent point, and that's why we're careful to use the term baseline. So that 80% is a baseline. That's not an acceptable rate. It's a baseline for determining the health of your instructional system and taking a close look at your Tier 1 core instruction. And the integrated MTSS framework, any integrated MTSS framework, pays attention to that, is strategic on let's look at what's happening with Tier 1 core instruction in terms of materials and the delivery of those materials and what are the needs there. So I think that, to your point, in an earlier question, when we think about the shift from response to intervention to an MTSS framework, we're really looking at not just directly thinking about what interventions we're providing to students, but also taking a careful look at what's happening in Tier 1 core instruction.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you said that, because that validates what I have said all the time about Tier 1 instruction being so vital. As we get ready to conclude our session today, our podcast, I do want to ask you, for our listeners' sake, what's the best advice that you would give them when they're thinking about the changes that need to happen for implementation for success with an integrated MTSS? Are there steps you would recommend? Are there things that you would think would help them in their understanding? What advice would you give a school, a principal, a teacher?
First, start with why. Why do we need to? We've had MTSS in our school or district for years. Why would we need to look at this state framework? That's a key question that I'm sure districts and schools are asking. And so start with the why. And what I'll say to that is, integrated MTSS matters. It has everything that's needed within it to provide the direction and the guidance for districts and schools to improve and deliver effective instruction to students. So it's worthwhile to take a second look at what is currently going on and look for areas of refinement and development. And communicating and understanding that first, understanding the why, and then communicating that to your district and building level staff will be critical in order to move any refinement work forward. And then secondly, take some time to learn what this is. We might think we know, but we always have areas to learn and grow. And I think any district or school will find areas where we can refine this. We can get better at this. We don't have this in place. Let's develop this. And I always think about it as, what's that magic that happens where the needle starts to turn, right? So I think that is a great way to think about taking a close look at the department's webpage. Each component has its own subpage that lists the essential features, and also how to create the conditions for success so that those essential features are highly effective and those components, those student learning components, are lived out in a way that will provide the results that we're looking for in the state. And then finally, that's when, once you've done those two things, then it's time to think about, okay, how do we do this? We've identified what we know why we're doing this. We know why we need to take a closer look at our existing work. We know where we need to refine or develop some things to enhance what we're doing. And now how do we do it? And that's hard. That how becomes the challenging part because there are so many entry points. So discerning that entry point, and when you're in the midst of refining and developing, and you get to the point where you're feeling overwhelmed as a district leader, as a building leader, as a classroom teacher, as an instructional coach, take your team back to 4 key questions. And I can't claim this. I will say that through our technical assistance with this AIR Center for MTSS, we work closely with Dr. Tessie Bailey, and she provided this guidance, and that is keep it simple. Don't make it complicated. We're really good in education at overcomplicating things.
Yes.
And so her advice, and I'll pass this along to all of you who are listening, keep it simple. And a way to do that is to keep the work focused on 4 questions. And these 4 questions can be found on the database decision-making webpage of the state framework. And they are this: when we're thinking about implementing our local integrated MTSS framework, we keep focused on these things. Who needs help? Where is help needed? What kind of help is needed? What instruction, supports, and resources will address the identified need? And then finally, are the selected instructional materials, supports, and resources effectively meeting the need? Because what we're talking about there is all of the complexity of those components and all of those essential features that are listed are really getting down to these 4 questions. And how we answer these 4 questions determines, are we getting it right? Are we off the mark a bit? And so if we're off the mark a bit, these are areas we definitely need to refine and just stay focused on improving instruction for kids.
You know, I can't thank you enough for coming today. I know that you're so busy at the department working on everything that's happening there. So I thank you so much for sharing your expertise and sharing your time today. It's a busy time, and I know that this took out some time from your day, and I just truly appreciate it. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us for at the table today. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Lolli, and it's been a pleasure to have you with us. If you found today's conversation valuable, be sure to subscribe and share with your colleagues. And for more leadership tools and professional learning resources, visit ohioleadership.org. And until next time, keep leading with purpose.